Okay, so last time we met, the last time we were talking about the patterns that evolved into the English Revolution. Now we're going to start talking about some of the reasons for the cause and the eventual arrival of the revolution. All right, so let's talk about the road to the English Civil War. Now, our first player in this role, aside from Elizabeth, the first problems that went on during her reign, was James the First. Now, he was Elizabeth's successor, who also ruled Scotland as James VI, and was much more overbearing and prone to make enemies than Elizabeth had been. Now, he lectured Parliament on the divine rights of kings, and even wrote a treatise on it called the True Law of Free Monarchies. I'll spell this out here, so if you're interested. The True Law of Free Monarchies. The True Law of Free Monarchies. And such an attitude did not sit well with Parliament. James' abrasive manner, his absolutist beliefs, his more Catholic concept of what the Church of England should be, and demands for money to support his lavish lifestyle made him many enemies who dubbed him the most learned fool in Christendom. Now, in religious matters, the king headed the High Commission, which exercised powers of censorship and excommunication, and appointed the higher clergy, who in turn chose the local clergy. So very hierarchical in this sense. Hierarchical. Hierarchy here. A very hierarchical system, right? And this is called the High Commission, as I mentioned earlier. The High Commission. News of the outside world came mainly from the clergy, who got their news from the higher clergy and ultimately the king. As Charles I put it, his son, people are governed by the pulpit more than the sword in times of peace. No wonder that religion became the main focal point of trouble at this time. There was also the issue of observing the Sabbath. Observing the Sabbath. Puritans felt that Sundays should be reserved for strictly religious activities and discussions. The king, fearing that such discussions might breed revolution, encouraged more frivolous sports on Sundays to keep people militarily fit and harmlessly occupied. Now, such a policy outraged the Puritans and turned them further against the king. Now, money was the other big source of conflict, and the House of Commons and Parliament was a primary battlefield. Now, among Parliament's most jealously guarded liberties was the right to grant taxes. This had not been such a vital issue when kings could largely get by on the revenue from their estates, various feudal fees, and the right to sell monopolies and titles. However, inflation further reduced the value of the royal estates after Elizabeth sold a quarter of them. James's own extravagant lifestyle and the rising costs of warfare in the 1500s and early 1600s led to growing friction between king and parliament over money. Parliament then was not so democratic in makeup as today. Even the House of Commons consisted solely of gentry, or lower nobles, and merchants. So gentry and merchants kind of made up Parliament at this time period, with an annual income of at least 40 shillings, a sizable sum back then. Now, the rights and privileges they jealously guarded and fought for, such as immunity from arrest and flogging and the right to free speech, were reserved for them alone, not the lower 90% of society. And as one member of Parliament put it, "He that hath no prosperity in his goods is not free." Still, the rights and privileges of Parliament, fought for and won in the 1600s, did set a precedent and eventually would extend to all of society. Now, James did have one growing source of revenue, and this was customs duties. So he did have custom duties as a reliable source of revenue, having to do with his foreign trade. Now, in order to take advantage of this, James raised the taxable value of various commodities to keep up with their real market value. which had risen due to inflation. Now, naturally, the merchants and Parliament disliked this tactic and disputed James's right to revise those values without Parliament's consent. Now, further aggravating James's problem was the lack of an efficient bureaucracy, such as was developing in the continental states. Taxes were collected by tax farming, where local merchants paid a lump sum to the king in advance and then collected however many taxes they could get away with. Now, this, of course, led to lower royal revenues, and more corruption and rising tension. Thus, the stage was set for a conflict between the king on one side and Parliament and the Puritans on the other. And during James's reign, relations with Parliament were generally stormy. Constant haggling over money and such religious issues as the existence of bishops in the Church of England would reach fever pitch and then subside with an occasional compromise to patch things up. Now, there was even a temporary alliance between king and Parliament when a proposed marriage alliance with Spain, which was very unpopular with Parliament, fell through and got England involved in the broader conflict known as the 30 Years' War. For the time being, this drove king and Parliament together against the common Catholic enemy. However, the overall situation was deteriorating, and by James's death in 1625, relations between the two parties were at best strained. Now, it was said that James steered the ship of state for the rocks, but left his son, Charles I, to wreck it. Now, Charles was very undiplomatic, insensitive to public opinion, and a weak monarch who let events get out of control and send England drifting toward civil war. Charles, like his father, was largely a victim of the times, being caught between rising prices and the rising aspirations of Parliament and the Puritans on one hand, and his own ideas favoring Catholicism and absolutism on the other. Charles even resorted to forcing loans out of men and imprisoning those who refused to cooperate. Now, in 1628, Parliament reacted by forcing Charles to sign the Petition of Right, in which he agreed not to levy taxes without Parliament's consent. So, if you want taxes, you need Parliament's consent. You can't just raise taxes if you're a king with this new Petition of Right. And you could also not imprison freemen without due process of law, or quarter troops with private citizens. And after this, he dissolved Parliament and ruled on his own. So no need to have Parliament anymore. Now, for the next 11 years, Charles managed to get by without Parliament by stretching various royal rights and fees to the limit. One of these methods was selling monopolies. Now, under this system, this is monopolies here, under this system, only the man who bought a monopoly on a particular type of goods had the exclusive right to sell or grant that right to others to sell those goods. Now, this wreaked havoc with prices and caused a good deal of discontent, especially since monopolies controlled a wide range of products, including buttons and pins, dyes, butter, tin, beer, barrels, tobacco, dice, pens, paper, gunpowder, feathers, soap, lace, and hay, to name just a few. Now, another method was extending the traditional ship's tax, previously levied only on coastal towns, to the whole country. Now, as unpopular as these measures were, they raised the king his money and kept him going. So he did manage to get a lot of money for his lavish lifestyle here. Now, Charles might have continued this indefinitely, but in 1637 he tried to impose the English Prayer Book. The English Prayer Book. The English Book of Prayer. On the Scots, and triggered a revolt instead. Now, unfortunately for Charles, so this is up in Scotland, this is going on here, the Scots, right? Unfortunately for Charles, many of the Scots were battle-hardened veterans from the 30 Years' War, who made short work of his largely untrained rabble. Now, desperately in need of money to continue his war, Charles called Parliament in 1644. However, after 3 weeks of arguing with Parliament over the last 11 years, parliamentary policies, the king dismissed this short parliament. However, the Scots did not go away, and instead they occupied a part of the north and made Charles promise a large sum of money every day until a final settlement was reached. Now, Charles had no choice but to call Parliament again, and this Parliament, known in history as the Long Parliament, because it would sit for over a decade and preside over a civil war and the end of absolute monarchy in England. Now, the events leading to the Civil War were a bit more straightforward. Charles, desperate for money and support to take care of the Scots, initially agreed to Parliament's demands. He would not levy taxes or dismiss Parliament without his consent, so no levying taxes and no dismissal. Because remember earlier he got the Petition of Rights kind of passed, but then he dismissed Parliament afterwards. So no dismissal of Parliament, and he would not take taxes without asking first. And he would agree to call Parliament at least every 3 years. So every 3 years you're going to call Parliament. He even let Parliament execute one of his chief ministers, Sir Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford. However, there was hardly peace between king and Parliament, only an uneasy truce. In November of 1641, a spark was struck which led to civil war. So November of 1641 is when the Civil War was sparked. So a spark was lit, November 1641. A revolt broke out in Ireland, with Irish Catholics killing thousands of English and Scottish Protestants who'd taken their best lands. An army was needed, but neither king nor Parliament was going to allow the other to command such an army. And when Parliament refused Charles's army, he sent troops in to arrest 5 parliamentary leaders. They found refuge in London and support from other towns. Charles left London, and by August 1642, England had plunged into civil war.